In today's presentation, we are going to cover the safe use of brush cutters and strimmers. Now, we have gone over a lot of this information before, but it is important for those doing the level 2 and the level 3 qualifications that they keep revising these, because a lot of this information will come up in your exam. What are the legal and regulatory requirements that govern the use of equipment and machinery? We have PURE 1998, Health and Safety at Work Act 1984, COSH 1994, Manual Handling Regulations 1992, and the Environment Act 1995. So a lot of these checks will be generic and they may not apply to your machinery, but it's important to carry out as many as possible on the strimmer or the brush cutter. Before use of any machinery, users should be able to follow this checklist to ensure that they have completed all necessary checks. The following checks should be carried out before every use. Any breakages, damage, or issues should be reported immediately to the person in charge of maintaining machinery, and any machinery that is deemed unsafe to use should be clearly labelled to ensure that it's not used. This same checklist applies to machinery without engines. Just leave out the non-applicable checks. And if you're unsure, ask. So checks before starting the machinery. What we're going to be doing here is visual inspections, checking for damage, any excessive corrosion, any signs of fluid leaks. Now, the fluid leaks might be the fuel tanks. They could also be the top and the heads, the gears, any sort of cracks or damage where the grease could potentially leak out. And you might not notice it till it's hot, but it is important to identify any sort of cracks beforehand. Visual inspections of belts and hoses for wear and damage. Now, on strimmers, this may be things such as the actual drive shaft, and especially on combi engines where the attachments will need to be put together. You'll be checking levels of engine oil, hydraulic oil, fluid oil, brake oil, coolant, antifreeze. Again, with strimmers, what we're going to be checking for here is the fuel in the tank is the correct mixture of two-stroke in the tank if you're using a two-stroke machine. If you're using a four-stroke machine, does it have enough engine oil in? Is it of good condition as well? Checking non-moving parts are safely secure, such as a battery or a radiator. Again, what we're looking at here with strimmers is any guards, any safety switches, handles, any sort of loose bits of trim. Can we ensure that they're safe before we're using? Or again, if they're not, can we identify that and mark the machine as not safe? The use of seat belts, again, that's not applicable to the strimmers, but something to bear in mind with other machines. And this is a big one that always comes up. Ensure that the correct safety decals and safety equipment is in place and it's in good condition. So having a guard on there is important, but having a guard that's in good working condition is even more important, because if the guard is broken, for example, it's not going to do its job. And it's also, you're not going to pass on your exam answering that question. But then most importantly, it's not going to be safe. Checking data plates, this is important because you want to make sure that it is actually the right machine. You could have a machine that's been marked to be not used, and perhaps someone's put the wrong tag on the wrong machine. So it's always worth double checking that it's the correct machine. You want to check any sort of blades or PTO driven attachments. Again, for a strimmer, this would be your blades on the brush cutter, or it would be your cord and the head of the strimmer on the strimmer itself. Check to ensure any safety pins are in place and in good working order. So again, this would be something like on the head of the strimmer, ensuring that when you've screwed it on, the pin was in correctly and it's not loose, and that's all good in that respect. Making sure the maintenance schedules are all up to scratch, all the parts have been lubricated that are necessary. Again, we go back to the strimmer head. That's one of the big things that needs lubricating on most strimmers. Now, tyre pressures and tyre wear is not applicable, but it's always something, again, worth keeping in mind. Make sure that the wheel nuts are tight. And then again, on the strimmer, just go around and make sure any nuts and bolts are all in good order. Anything from the handles, the engine, again, all the way back to the head. If you had other machinery, at this point, we're also going to be checking the tow bars, linkages, or any attachments. Checking the windscreen washer, making sure the horn works. Obviously, this is not applicable to the strimmer. Keep that in mind. Checks after starting the machinery. Now, this one is really important because it's all good and well being able to use the machine, but if you can't stop it, it's just as dangerous as it being used improperly or incorrectly. So what you're going to do is, once you've started the machine, is basically use the kill switch. Turn it off, see if it turns off, and if it does turn off, you're good. The kill switch might be different on other machines, but there might also be other things such as foot pedals that you need to take into account to ensure that they're working correctly as well. not just during the pre-start checks, but also afterwards, because obviously having the machine turned on is a lot different than having the machine stationary. Checking for warning lights and any instruments. Again, this is not really applicable to a strimmer, but it's always important. Lights, parking brakes, and any power assisted parts. We don't really have any of these on a strimmer, but always keep it in mind. Now we're into the parts which really do apply to strimmers. So checking the areas before use. It is important to check areas before strimming or brush cutting. What you should be checking for is stones, sticks and branches, any litter, especially grass, which can be quite dangerous, any wildlife, nests, birds, habitats, any power services, any water services, any sort of drains around. Is the surface uneven or is it slippery? Is there any debris, including animal droppings? Make sure to note any nearby windows, cars, and glass and valuables. It is always recommended to trim with your back towards glass or anything valuable to just ensure that if anything does flick up, it doesn't go in the direction of what you're trying to protect. The aim of checking is to lower the chance of any possible risk, such as flying debris, as I mentioned, and falling down the service hole. All the things we can do to protect ourselves and the area that we're working in is to restrict the area and signpost. Ensure that areas are closed off or cordoned off, having warning signs in place to show you're cutting. It's also required by the manufacturer to be a certain distance away from the members of the public or other workers. This can be defined in the manual for each machine. So what we're looking out for here is warning signs, any temporary fences or cones. Can we have a banks person watching us? We need to be aware of traffic every few minutes or every few half a minute. Poke your head up, make sure no one's around. Make sure you've got your PPE on. And does anyone around you need PPE? Do you need to make an exclusion zone big enough so anyone around doesn't actually need to wear ear defenders? We're not going to have pedestrians walking close by. And then again, with co-workers, are we having anyone that's standing as the banks person? Do they need their PPE on? Do they need their glasses? Do they need their ear defenders? Changing the cord is a big thing on strimmers. Now, these will vary massively depending on the make and model. However, they all do have a similar function. The cord is wrapped around an internal head, which releases the cord as required. It's important to ensure that after the new cord is installed to check that the fittings are all in correctly and in place and not loose. And if the head is damaged or excessively worn, it should be reported, removed, recorded, and removed from use and replaced. Cord can vary in size, shape, and colour. Each will have a different set of properties that will be outlined by the manufacturer of the cord. The manufacturer of the strimming or brush cutting device will also recommend what is best for that machine. And something to take into mind is to always use biodegradable cord when possible. Having plastics in the environment is obviously a bad thing, and the more we can minimize that, the better. Believe it or not, there is waste produced when strimming or brush cutting. I know a lot of us will tend to leave this waste on site or on the ground, which is completely fine depending on the situation. But there is times when it does need to be cleared up and collected. And it does make a lot of waste, especially around the edges of lawns. So it's always recommended to trim first and then mow afterwards to collect your waste. So that's a good way of disposing of the waste as well. But another way of doing it, if you're doing a large area or banked area or an inaccessible area, is the area can be raked afterwards and then collected with wheelbarrows or any sort of manner that you have. Then actually disposing of the waste, it can be composted or it can be disposed of in an appropriate manner. So whether that goes off site or stays on site completely depends on your situation. One big thing to mention is to ensure that you're wearing PPE and gloves when handling any waste. Using the correct machine for the job. A great example of using the correct machine for a job would be a flail mower rather than using a brush cutter on a large area. Although the strimmer or the brush cutter might do the better job, you'll be exposed to the machine for a longer time, and this will lead to premature fatigue and tiredness, and also excessive wear on the machine. Using the correct machine is not only safer, but can also save time and money for your employer. Fuel and lubrication. Now, most trimmers, chainsaws, pole saws, brush cutters, leaf blowers, you name it, are two-stroke engines. And these engines require a mixture of fuel and oil to be added to the fuel tank. This mixture results in both engine combustion and lubrication at the same time. Operating a two-stroke engine on petrol alone will result in engine failure. The mixture will depend on the manufacturer's recommendations. However, 50 to 1 and 25 to 1 are the typical measurements. Strimmers and brush cutters usually only require greasing of the head and gear mechanisms. Depending on the manufacturer, this may require the removal of a cover, bolt, or the use of a grease gun on a grease nibble. It's important to use the correct lubrication to avoid premature failure. Risk assessments. The purpose of risk assessments is to ultimately improve the workplace health and safety. To achieve this, the risk assessment process needs to identify the workplace hazards and reduce or eliminate the risks they pose. Risk assessments should raise awareness about hazards and risks and communicate health and safety information to workers. Findings should also be recorded to achieve and demonstrate compliance with health and safety legislation. Risk assessments should include all of the previous information: PPE, pre-start checks, checking areas, and let's think of other things. What may cause harm? What may cause issues? Any debris, any glass? Is the machine broken?